What would a US invasion of Greenland actually look like? Well, it would look like denial warfare, political fracture, and an alliance eating itself alive. Hey friends, Wes here, and I can't believe this video even exists, but when senior American officials start saying things like military options are on the table to take Greenland, well, here we are. Very briefly, here's the frame. Greenland is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. Denmark is a NATO ally. Greenland has self-government and a legally protected right to decide its own future. So the moment the United States threatens force, this stops being a hard bargaining and becomes an alliance integrity crisis. That matters because NATO was built to deter external enemies, not referee a fight where the biggest member decides to go feral. Now, most of this never leaves conference rooms, but if it did, if coercion failed and force entered the picture, the real question wouldn't be, can the US take Greenland? Of course it can. The real question is whether it could hold it cleanly, reinforce it safely, and survive the political fallout. That's where the problems begin. If shots were fired, NATO as a formal institution would likely freeze. Now, people love to jump to Article 5, the famous attack one, attack all clause, like it's a big red button labeled war. That's not how the treaty reads. NATO's official treaty text says that if an armed attack occurs, each ally will assist by taking such actions as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force. The key phrase is, as it deems necessary. It is not automatic, and it is not uniform. This means each ally can decide for itself how much help it wants to give. Even worse, NATO functions by consensus. The alliance was built to deter the Soviet Union, not to discipline the United States. There is no clean, elegant, ready-made mechanism for the biggest kid in the alliance decide to go rogue. So if Denmark tried to trigger Article 5 against the United States, NATO as an institution would likely seize up or dissolve completely. The alliance would not seamlessly pivot into combat operations against Washington. You would get paralysis, emergency diplomacy, and a frantic effort to keep the alliance from tearing itself apart in public. Consensus collapses when one of the founders is the aggressor. So what you would see instead is an ad hoc Nordic coalition. Let's say Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark against the United States. They would form this coalition outside of NATO command, frame it as collective self-defense in support of Denmark and Greenland's elected government. And the war aims here matter. This coalition would not try to defeat the US military. That's fantasy. The goal would be denial, not conquest. Prevent a clean lodgment, disrupt reinforcements, raise the cost until Washington backs down or negotiates. That turns Greenland into a contest about access, logistics, and legitimacy. And Greenland is brutal terrain for all three. So before the first shot, everything changes. Denmark rallies politically and legally. Greenland's elected leadership becomes central. If Nuke formally requests assistance, the Nordic coalition gains legitimacy oxygen. Longtime US allies in Europe, namely the United Kingdom, would likely sit this one out. Pip pip, cheerio, sorry old boy, you're on your own on this one. That was horrible, horrible accent. The Nordics, however, would move. Air assets disperse and surge, naval units push into the North Atlantic approaches, intelligence sharing goes into overdrive. Undersea surveillance and maritime domain awareness become the obsession. The Nordic coalition wants to see US movements early and force Washington to operate under constant observation. This becomes a surveillance war before it becomes a shooting war. And this is where Sweden earns its keep. Sweden's first contribution is not fighters, it's information. FRA, Sweden's National Signals Intelligence Authority, exists for this exact kind of national emergency. Foreign SIGINT plus cybersecurity support to the government and critical infrastructure. On top of that, Sweden can put airborne SIGINT into the air quickly using its S-102 Korpen platform, which has a public track record of intelligence gathering sorties near sensitive areas. Denmark gets early warning of US force movement patterns, emissions mapping, comms collection, and a clearer picture of how Washington is running the operation. Sweden operates Saab 340 AEW&C aircraft with the Erie radar built to track aircraft and ships. and to extend the recognized air and maritime picture. That aircraft becomes a combat enhancer for Denmark and Norway by improving queuing and helping deconflict a crowded airspace that's about to get very tense. In Phase 1, Sweden would likely fly these over the Baltic and southern Scandinavia, not Greenland. That frees Danish attention and assets by stabilizing Denmark's home region while Copenhagen focuses on the Greenland crisis. Sweden would surge Gripen sorties to tighten air policing, escort, and rapid reaction alert coverage in the Nordic region. Sweden's Gripen E has entered Swedish Air Force operational service, and Sweden still operates Gripen C/D, giving it a solid fighter force for regional defensive missions. Rear area airfields and ports get covered by ground-based air defense. The goal here for Sweden is simple: keep Denmark's logistic arteries safe while attention shifts west. At sea, Sweden plays its favorite card: quiet ones. Submarines. You don't need many, you need presence, uncertainty, and tracking. Sweden's undersea card is the Gotland-class submarine force, 3 boats designed for the very missions that matter in early crises: intelligence collection, forward surveillance, and sea denial. On the surface side, Sweden can sortie Visby-class corvettes, a stealthy littoral combatant built around sensors, speed, and anti-ship punch. This is where social media loses the plot. This is not about beating the US military, it's about slowing it down. Norway fields fully operational 5th-generation fighters. Denmark has F-35s in service and more on the way. And contrary to some conspiracy theories, the US does not have kill switches inside their F-35s. Now, is that parity with US global power? No. Does it need to be? Also no. Denial only requires enough capability to make timelines slip and costs rise. It's still interesting to imagine Gripen E's going up against American F-22 Raptors. Who would win that fight, Gripen or Raptor? Let me know what you think in the comments. Now, at sea, the coalition shadows and pressures sea lift. American heavy equipment would arrive by ship. You make that risky and everything slows. In the air, the focus is on tankers and corridors. You can fly in people quickly, you cannot fly in an armored brigade overnight. Now let's talk about the other side of the board, the Americans, because if the Nordics are building a denial strategy, they're building it against the most logistically capable military on Earth. If the Pentagon had to assemble a Greenland invasion package, it would not look like the Maduro raid with snow sprinkled on top. Caracas was a decapitation sprint, measured in hours, built around shock, suppression, and speed. Greenland is not exactly Venezuela 2 electric boogaloo. It is a logistics problem wearing a parka. That said, the Venezuela benchmark matters. Reporting on Operation Absolute Resolve described the U.S. launching over 150 aircraft from roughly 20 locations, with elite ground units and special operations aviation thrown in for funsies. If Washington decided to move fast in the high north, it could bring scale quickly. The question is what that scale is for, because there are 2 very different packages here. One is an opening move designed to seize nodes and force a political outcome. The other is a follow-on force designed to hold ground and endure. Those are not the same thing. So let's start with the opening move. If the US wants to win the first 72 hours, it brings a force package built to seize and lock key nodes. In Greenland, nodes are everything: airfields, ports, comms infrastructure, fuel and power, the places where a map turns into a supply chain. So what does this seizure package look like? Well, it likely starts with Joint Special Operations Command assault elements, JSOC elements. If Washington wants a high-precision opening, you would see a national mission force option with the enablers that make that kind of operation work. Then you add the most classic airfield seizure unit on the US roster, the 75th Ranger Regiment, because that is literally their job. They kick the door in, secure the runway, establish perimeter control, and buy time for the next wave. After that, you need follow-on infantry, fast. That points to an airborne infantry element, something like the 82nd Airborne as a ready brigade option, because the mission becomes less about killing a target and more about capturing infrastructure and holding it long enough that politics can catch up. Then come the Marines Semper Fi, because this is not a beach assault fantasy, but because Marines are built for expeditionary security and flexible crisis response. If ports become relevant, or if the US wants a scalable presence without immediately committing heavy army formations, well, Marines fit that early posture perfectly. Now, layer in aviation that makes the opening move possible. If the US wants fast and precise, it leans on special operations aviation, the 160th SOAR that we saw in Venezuela, for low-level insertion, night operations, and moving the first wave. That matches the reporting we saw in Venezuela. But Greenland forces a different mix in the next breath. You need more fixed-wing airlift because everything is far and heavy. You need more C-17s, more C-130s. You need more tankers because distances and loiter time in the high north eat fuel for breakfast. You need a heavier search and rescue posture because the environment punishes mistakes, and because once aircraft start operating at tempo in Arctic conditions, mishaps go from possible to predictable. Then we get to air power, which is the center of gravity for the opening phase. In Venezuela, the US used a massive air armada and electronic warfare to avoid losses against Russian-made systems. Greenland's air problem depends on whether resistance stays political or becomes kinetic. If Denmark and Greenland resist politically, air threats remain low. The US can run an air brigade without meaningful opposition. If Nordic states decide to fight, the air threat becomes real very fast. Denmark and Norway field those F-35s I mentioned. Sweden fields the Gripens, and they can surge, they can disperse, they can complicate US timing. So the US likely brings a layered air package designed to do one thing above all else: protect the bridge. That means stealth fighters, F-35s for strike and suppression, and potentially F-22s if Washington decides this is a high-end air contest and it wants air superiority insurance. It means electronic attack aircraft like the EA-18G Growler to jam and blind. It means heavy ISR, the sort of RC-135 and signals collection missions that help you map emissions and predict intercept patterns. It means tankers, lots and lots of tankers, because fighters do not live in the air without them. And once nodes are seized, it means air and missile defense coverage, because you can't park aircraft and supplies on a runway in a modern fight and just hope everyone behaves. So Patriot-type coverage for area defense, point defense for close-in threats, counter-drone coverage because that threat follows you everywhere now. The key is not bomb Denmark. The key is make it impossible for anyone to stop the Airbridge. Now, let's talk about the naval backbone, because this is where Greenland stops being a raid and becomes a campaign. Heavy equipment and sustained supply do not teleport. If the US intends durable control, it needs sea lines. That requires sea control, sea lift, and the boring stuff that actually wins. So you would expect a carrier strike group to provide air cover and power projection, even if much of the aviation effort still flows through the good old US Air Force. You would expect an amphibious ready group with a Marine expeditionary unit because it gives the US multiple landing options and a flexible crisis response toolkit. You would expect attack submarines because undersea dominance is how you keep adversary navies honest and how you protect your own surface movement in contested waters. And you would expect logistics ships. Lots of them, because the only thing worse than a contested North Atlantic is a contested North Atlantic where you run out of fuel. Now, this is the part the internet always skips because logistics is not cinematic. It's also the reason wars are won and lost. Now, seizing an airfield is a headline. Holding Greenland is a posture, and posture is where the bill comes due. That means cold weather competence, not as a nice to have, but as a survival requirement. Compare this to Venezuela's 150 aircraft raid. For a short, sharp, seize-a-node operation, the US could absolutely match that scale, and the reporting shows it is willing to surge major air power for a political objective. For a sustained Greenland campaign, though, aircraft count is not the headline. The headline is the sustainment math. How many days of supplies can you push through in winter? How many sorties can you generate in Arctic weather? How many tankers do you have available And how many can you spare from other global commitments? How long can you keep ships and aircraft operating safely in the North Atlantic while being watched, challenged, and politically isolated? If the Nordics fight, the US can still bring overwhelming mass, but the cost curve spikes hard because you are no longer raiding a compound, you are contesting air and sea approaches against modern allied air forces in their neighborhood. And at that point, this stops being a question of capability. It becomes a question of time, political will, and how much damage you're willing to do to your own alliances to get a trophy. So here's the core problem for Washington. The US already has access to Greenland. It already has the base it needs. It already supports critical missions there. So coercion trades access with consent for control without legitimacy. That's the same mistake Russia made in Ukraine. Even if the US establishes a foothold, the coalition can keep costs high and legitimacy low. That's how winning turns into a bleed. The best case outcome? Negotiated stand down. Everyone calls it de-escalation. The worst case outcome is alliance fracture, defense decoupling, and adversaries watching the West punch itself in the face. This scenario doesn't exist because of strategy. It exists because of mindset, a worldview where land is a trophy and alliances are paperwork, and intimidation substitutes for persuasion. That mindset is dangerous. It discounts consent, it discounts public opinion, and it discounts second-order effects. Greenland exposes it perfectly. Power isn't measured by what you can seize, it's measured by what you don't need to. If this scenario ever stopped being hypothetical, the first casualty wouldn't be Denmark, it would be NATO's credibility. And Moscow and Beijing wouldn't need to fire a shot. They would just hit the record button. So this isn't really about Greenland. It's about whether alliances are strategic capital or disposable props. One of those worlds is stable. The other one gets very loud, very fast, and very stupid. That's it for today, my friends. Subscribing is the best free way to support this channel. We, the United States, already have Greenland. This is insane that I'm even talking about this. We don't need to make an enemy out of a NATO ally, Denmark. Anyways, thanks for watching, and as always, glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. Crimea is Ukraine.